Now, as her dad, they don't go to her website very often. I just call her. Yeah. To the link to her website and okay. Well, good morning.
Morning.
All right, so thank you. Yeah, I apologize. I got a new computer, which is great. Don't apologize for that. But there's a lot of little things that this new computer has not done before, and one of them is get into YouTube. So we're gonna just record this on computer and I'll upload it later.
Understand.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, and then I think I've got it so that I can admit people over here. Can people on the screen hear us?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right.
Christian,
All right,
it could be, Christian, it could be a little louder if that's possible.
This is about
Your volume.
Unfortunately.
Okay.
I think this is about what we're gonna be able to do. We'll do our best. For
Okay.
today. Yeah, well, good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome, everybody. It's a nice sunny day, right? Not snowing. That's a change. That's a nice change this winter. Welcome back. Thank you. We took last week off. I've had so many things happen between when I was out of town to now that I almost feels like an age ago. But it was a good ceremony. It was good to be with my family, my dad, and I really appreciate our flexibility and meeting together. Just to remind you, we don't meet next week because I'm going on vacation tomorrow and I will not be around.
I thought it was St. Patrick's Day while you.
No, but that would be a good excuse.
You're gonna go somewhere where we'll be jealous of, hopefully?
Yeah, we're gonna be in Mexico, I think.
Nice.
Yeah, so. Yeah, we will. We're gonna go to one of the less elevated areas. So I'll be sure to be in touch with you, after I get back. And, my plan right now is that we'll meet on the 27th. Barring getting back and being totally inundated with something else. But that is the plan. I think after that, we will have a couple of other dates that we will probably take off. Easter Monday up in can you believe it's gonna be April before you know it? And then maybe one more date somewhere in sometime I think around May 22nd or 23rd. So with that being said, let me share my screen, see if this works. Yeah, I think it's gonna work. It works. We're gonna have, maybe we pull those couple of those down, or I don't know.
It helps with the overhead off.
All right. It's not doing that. It's not doing that on my screen. Can you guys see that?
It's black.
It's just off the screen over here.
On mine.
Okay.
New technology, great.
Yeah, this is a new computer.
We're gonna get taken over by Google.
we go.
There you go. Yeah, looks good. Looks great.
Yeah, that's not it though.
Oh, but still looks great.
Okay.
That's what's on the screen over here though. Isn't it? Yeah. There, yeah, you got it. Well, now you don't. You did.
Yeah, that's,
You know what you ought to do, Christian? You ought to name your new computer Titanic if you want it to sink.
ha, ha, ha.
No, Winter.
Okay. Does not have? Why is that not showing up over there?
Doesn't make any sense, does it? And, yeah. I don't know why they're not talking to each other. I wish I had smarter things. This will stop other screen sharing. You
Slide it out, that would be the solution.
Okay, well, wait a minute. Can people online, can you guys see the slideshow?
No, it's black.
All right. Okay, well, we're gonna do our best then. I guess I'll just back to this,
I think it's lecture, we all went to school in those ages when we had no visuals.
right?
Yeah.
What good was lectures?
Okay,
Now it's on. It's on.
okay, all right. Will someone pray for us? Can I get a volunteer? Okay, thank you.
My Father, what a mystery this all is, let alone your word. Thank you for Christian. Thank you that he has been away and it's been a success, that he's back with all of us. Help us to be kind and loving, giving, and help us focus on your word. In Jesus' name, amen.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Well, greetings to you. Then let's just jump in. We're gonna go with this display. So we won't have quite as many of the bells and whistles, but you'll kind of get the basic idea. We are up into chapter 13 in our study, and we have we've traveled a good bit just to sort of remind us. Of course, chapter 2, the big chapter in the book of Acts, sets the tone for everything, Day of Pentecost. And basically from chapter 2 to about chapter 8 is events taking place in and around Jerusalem. Once we turn into chapter 9, portions of chapter 8, we now start to have the gospel movement, the Jesus movement, spreading out beyond the confines of Palestine, effectively. We have a series then of really kind of world upside down turning kinds of events, right? In terms of the kinds of people to whom the gospel comes, the kinds of people whom the Spirit is poured out upon. Oftentimes to the astonishment, maybe even chagrin of some people who are actually in the church. They certainly are not expecting that. So just to remind us, of course, first it's in Samaria, then it's to the ends of the earth in the person of the Ethiopian eunuch. Then one of the great enemies at the time of the church, Saul, who was effectively seeking its destruction, is turned radically and becomes a spokesperson. And then, of course, we get the massive explosion, really, of the welcoming of a Gentile in the person of Cornelius. Now, just to remind ourselves, we're still moving in steps, so there's going to be more steps to come. But one of the things I think that's important for us to remember about Cornelius, and hopefully when we get to one of the episodes today, is that he would be considered what we might call a God-fearing Jew. This is a category, I think, that's been sort of created by scholars to identify this sort of third subset of people in the ancient world and from a Jewish perspective. From a Jewish perspective, there were Jews, then there were the nations. And there were some bickering, I'm sure, between Palestinian Jews and diaspora Jews, but still all Jews effectively, right, belong together. And then Gentiles, that was the nations, right? They were different. But there was another sort of subgroup, effectively, that came to be called, or has come to be called, God-fearers, and these are Gentiles who were attracted to Judaism, who were attracted to the message, the promises, the practices, the ethics, all of that, and they would attend synagogue. They might even try to keep kosher. They might observe Sabbath. They pretty much would do everything except take the final step of being circumcised. And so Cornelius fits into that category, and what that means is that he is somewhat familiar with the traditions of Israel, right? So we haven't yet had an encounter with a Gentile or Gentile population who doesn't know anything about Judaism. And that's actually not going to happen really until hopefully I think we get to one of the episodes today. With Cornelius and with this kind of extraordinary story that takes place in chapters 10 and then is repeated pretty much verbatim in chapter 11. And I think I tried to emphasize, this is a huge deal. The fact that it takes 3 chapters to settle, or even come close to settling what's happened with the bringing of Cornelius in indicates to us that this is a big deal and that it was not as smooth, certainly probably not as smooth as it might feel even in our reading in terms of integrating Jews and Gentiles. That's something that will come back in chapter 15, which we'll get to sometime down the road. So that brings us up to about chapter 11, and then chapter 12, which is kind of what we spent most of our time kind of moving through, reminded us in a sense of with the winds of change come the waves of resistance, right? So as we went through the gospel story in Luke, as we've gone through the story in Acts, what we find is the Spirit at work, and there still is resistance to that Spirit. And so chapter 12 is a great sort of all of a sudden, Herod, the great villain, reappears on the stage. And we get this really interesting story, which in a sense is like a typological resurrection. And what I mean by that is Herod kills James, the brother of John, sees how much it pleases the elite, the Jews, seizes Peter with the intention of killing Peter too. Peter is locked up and in a situation where I think it would be fair to say he's as good as dead. And of course it talks about how tired and sleepy he is. And what is the church doing in the meantime? They're praying for Peter. We don't know exactly what, presumably for his care, his release, something of that nature. And an angel comes in and sets Peter free, but he doesn't wake up for most of the episode. He thinks he's seeing a vision or dreaming a dream. And it's not until he's outside of the tomb or outside of the gates of the prison, right? And all of a sudden he wakes up. And this is what I mean by it. It's like a resurrection story, part 2, sort of in a typological sense. Then at the very end of our chapter, this is really point 1, we are returned to Herod. So we meet Herod at the beginning, this really remarkable story of Peter being set free from the prison takes place in the middle, and then Herod reappears at the end. And the story of Herod accentuates his arrogance, his mendacity, the fact that he seems to be taciturn and can easily be angered. And if he gets angry at you, better watch out, as we have found out already in the stories dealing with the early Christians. Well, he's sitting in a public space holding forth. Someone acclaims him a god. He doesn't, deny that, and then all of a sudden he's struck down. I think the point of the story of the whole of the chapter is to say, yes, there is resistance, but in a sense, it's it repeats what we heard all the way back, like chapter 3 or 4, when Gamaliel got up and said, if this move is from God, it would be futile to resist it. So even though the resistance to the gospel story is real, is deadly, and deadly serious, God nevertheless is going to move things forward. And that's kind of what we get, I think, underneath some of these stories. Then we turn to chapter 13, which introduces us, takes us up to Antioch, and introduces us to the city or the community in Antioch, which is, as I say up here, or I don't know if I say it, maybe I do. Yeah, a multi-ethnic community where the people are first called Christians. And effectively, that's what we get. We get a description of prophets and teachers from around the Mediterranean. We don't get any story as to why they're there. We also, of course, are reintroduced to Paul or Saul and Barnabas, who are going to be kind of the primary figures that we're going to follow as we move through the rest of the story. And in a sense, I think it would be fair to say that with entering into chapter 13, we now pivot into the story, and most of the rest of the book of Acts really is going to tell us about the spread of the gospel among the Gentiles. That's kind of the basic story that's going to stay with us as we move through. Very importantly, our third point here has to do with the fact that it's not the community at Antioch that sets aside Saul and Barnabas and kind of gives them their calling and sets them in motion. It's rather the Spirit. Playing on what we've seen kind of pretty much all the way through this book, which is that this is not so much the acts of the apostles as it is the acts of the Spirit. It's the Spirit that falls on Gentiles before anyone in the church is ready for that. It's the Spirit that pushes Paul and Barnabas out the door and onto the road. And we follow that story, at least in part. And then lastly, as they are set aside, we now enter into their first journey. I think there's three journeys that they will have over the course of the rest of the book of Acts. And the story begins with a little interlude episode on the island of Cyprus. And each place there's a bit of a replication, right? They'll come to town, they'll go and they'll hang out, they'll visit with the Jews. It may or may not go well. There'll be some kind of confrontation, and then they'll have to leave. And that repetition kind of does show up again and again. By this point in time, Paul and Barnabas, or Saul and Barnabas, actually it's right in that period where we get this very sort of nonchalant Saul, whose name was Paul, was also called Paul or whatever, blah, 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 blah. He gets up and says and does something. And the rest of the story, we never hear anything about Saul anymore. We only hear about Paul. Well, now Paul and Barnabas, they leave the island of Cyprus and take a boat up to the southern coast of what would be modern day Turkey. And they make their way inland about 170 kilometers or so to the city of Antioch. There were many Antiochs around the ancient world because there was a guy named Antiochus Epiphanes who was a bit of a piece of work, you know what I mean? And he established many cities named after him, and typically the region kind of told you where they were, except the one city, Antioch. And then the Antioch, that's the big one. So, all right, that's where we are. Paul has gotten up and preached. At city of Antioch, we do get a little bit more elaborate kind of introduction to their methods. They went to the synagogue when they first kind of get there. They're invited to speak, which is actually something that we mentioned is pretty typical. Paul gets up, and we get the first speech from Paul in the book of Acts there. He spends his time in the speech talking about basically rooting or textualizing the message of Jesus, the person of Jesus, in the story of Israel. Second part of his speech, he then talks about the responsibility of the Jerusalem elite for the murder of Jesus, and yet God raising him from the dead. And now we are to the final portion of his speech. What is that? What just happened?
What did it make that?
On down to the next slide, looks like the one you want.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Thank you. All right.
You can tell that from here.
Jeff. Okay, I'm gonna volunteer to read the passage. Okay, all right, Jeff.
Okay, let it be known to you therefore, my brothers, that through this man, forgiveness of sins is proclaimed to you. By this Jesus, everyone who believes is set free from all those sins from which you could not be freed by the law of Moses. Beware, therefore, that what the prophet said does not happen to you. Look, you scoffers, be amazed and perish, for in your days I am doing a work that you will never believe, even if somebody tells you. As Paul and Barnabas were going out, the people urged them to speak about these things again the next Sabbath. When the meeting of the synagogue broke up, many Jews and devout converts to Judaism followed Paul and Barnabas, who spoke to them and urged them to continue in the grace of God.
All right. Okay, so this is the last portion of Paul's speech, where he sort of turns and makes the pitch, you might say, to the crowd. And as I mentioned here, this is the place then where he highlights the significance of Jesus, right? He's told the story in context with Israel and the promises of God, responsibility of those in Jerusalem for Jesus' death and God's response to that of raising him from the dead. And now he delivers on that kind of final punchline. Because of what God did in Jesus, forgiveness of sins or release of the debt is another way of saying that, is proclaimed in the name of this person because what God has done for him. So Paul proclaims that significance. And here we encounter really, in some ways, I think this is not a phrase that we often find in the book of Acts, but it's obviously quite prominent here, which is the forgiveness of sins. And the way that he talks about this is very interesting. He says, let it be known to you, therefore, my brothers, that through this man, forgiveness of sins is proclaimed to you. By this Jesus, everyone who believes is set free from all those sins from which you could not be freed by the law of Moses. Now, that little phrase, that second element is very interesting because the law has built into it numerous mechanisms by which you can secure forgiveness. So what precisely does Paul mean by this? And it's not necessarily spelled out here. So there's been some conjecture. So that reminder up there, the law did in fact provide a means to find forgiveness. But the question, of course, is what is Paul talking about here? Now, there are a couple of things that he might be talking about, and we would probably have to go to his letters to find those out. One of them off the top of my head is simply that Paul says that the law was never going to be able to fully set you free from the power of sin because the blood of bulls and goats is not effective to do that, right? Rather, you would need something else. The other one that struck me as a possibility, though, is one of the arguments that Paul makes in the book of Galatians, where we get really, I think, in the New Testament, the strongest sort of contrast between what the law could do and what happened in Jesus is kind of spelled out in that book. And one of the things that Paul makes clear is that the law, for all of its goodness, was incapable of giving life, and especially of giving the life of the Spirit. And so it could be that is what he is referring to, and that's kind of the option I wanted to highlight especially. that the resurrection of Jesus can and does offer what the law promised but could not come through on, right? Which was long life, choose life or death. That was one of the things that Moses put for the people of Israel. Ultimately, the law was not able to accomplish that, according to Paul. But what was the resurrection of Jesus, right? Being baptized into him, being incorporated in some sense in his life. Then we get, after that, sort of again, somewhat cryptic, but I hope we have some kind of a working idea about the power of what's unleashed in Jesus from Paul's perspective. We have what I describe as a hyperbolic statement. What I mean by that is an overstatement, right? And this was a typical rabbinic tactic, and it was meant specifically to elicit from the hearers a response, right? So he says, beware therefore that what the prophet said does not happen to you. Quote, look, you scoffers, be amazed and perish, for in your days I am doing a work that you will never believe, even if someone tells you. So I think this kind of gives us a sense of the rhetorical flourish of Paul. We then have the short little set of verses 42 through 43, that set us up for what's coming next, which is there's a pretty positive regard for Paul, positive response to the message. People hear, some of them perhaps even seem to believe or agree with him, right? So when the meeting of the synagogue broke up, many Jews and devout converts to Judaism followed Paul and Barnabas, who spoke to them and urged them to continue in the grace of God. So, we know something else is coming, right? The other shoe has to fall. Let me stop there, though, and see what kind of comments or questions you might. It's a little bit warm in here. Yep. Yeah, I thought it was. While you're thinking of questions, I'm going to turn this on. We'll see if this interferes with my computer.
Oh my gosh, your screen just went blank.
Shut up.
Just popped in my head. I don't know if it has any relevance or not, but in the when he says, be amazed and perish, I'm doing this work that you'll never believe, even if someone tells you, it just reminded me of God hardening Pharaoh's heart. And I don't know if there's anything there or not, but it just seems like that was a prophetic voice then, and this is a prophetic voice now. I don't know, that just connected in my head. So I didn't know if there's any echo, I guess, from that.
Yeah, what's the question behind your question, though?
What's the question behind my question? Oh, I don't know. I just found it interesting that popped in my head. That it was just saying, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen, and you won't believe it.
Yeah, it's so amazing you won't believe it.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And I was just wondering if, when Pharaoh was told, I'm telling you this is what has happened.
Yeah.
It's going to happen. And you're not going to believe it. So well, I just find it interesting.
I think it's the similar kind of, there's several principles that are different.
Yeah.
But there is a kind of, stunning argument in a sense that he's trying to make this some marginal Jew like Palestine has been raised from the dead. And now you're telling me that we're set free in a way that even the law cannot secure for us. And that is a threat, by the way. And I'm gonna come back to that in just a minute. I think from a perspective of a diaspora Jew, that's good news and scary news. And I'll return to that. But yeah, and then it's a great tool, right, for cajoling people. Yeah. Don't be like Pharaoh. Like, be open to the possibility. And what it actually strikes me now, one of the things I've been reading this book written by a Talmud scholar, and it's on the book of Leviticus. So I'm reading a book about Leviticus.
Wow.
Yeah, that's right. That's what happens.
Have fun in Mexico.
Yeah, she's really Mexican. But she mentioned that there's this descriptor that we find in the Torah that talks talks about the people of Israel as stiff-necked. Right? And the image there of being stiff-necked is that you're unable to turn your head and contemplate the possibility that other things might be happening. And I think there's something about that here of being open to the possibility that something might be happening that you simply do not expect or even maybe comprehend initially. So I think, yeah, there's a kind of interesting echo there, maybe back to the Pharaoh.
Remind me again about the authorship of this book, because it reads like an eyewitness account. And they're close, and then this is going on, and they're going here, and they're going there. I mean, this is the companion book to Luke, right?
Right.
But, I mean, was somebody going along taking notes here, or was this?
Well, I think, so Luke tells us at both the beginning of his gospel and at the beginning of this book, I don't know, it's hard to know, like, is this a novella? There's all kind of genre assignments to make sense of what Acts is. That he investigated sources, right? So I think what we can take from that is he's working with sources. There's a hypothesis that there's an Antioch source that he had access to. There are probably other sources as well. And then there's a couple of places in the story where the pronouns he switches from like kind of into an inclusive pronoun that indicates some sort of an eyewitness component. So I think there's a sense that he's working with enough to stitch together precisely where the eyewitness event happens. It's not always clear, but sometimes. That's right. And then most of the speeches are more than likely Luke's instruction, but they're based on in conversations. There's a couple of places where that is not necessarily the case, that scholars argue this is unique enough. In the way that they kind of came to this is that you compare all the speeches and they sound an awful lot alike like one another, grammatically, phraseologically, whatever. But there are a couple that are unique, and they're like, this might actually be, what was actually said, et cetera. So, and remember, of course, he's writing 30 to 40 years after these events, in terms of when this kind of came out. Yeah.
Yes, the devout converts, everything needs devout converts to survive. And along with many Jews, they were the ones that encouraged them.
Yeah.
And that
So it's a mixed. Right.
we're losing the Jews, we're losing their future.
Right.
How is it going to extrapolate?
Right, and I think one of the more unfortunate things that I just want us to remember as we go through, it's Luke doesn't always hold to this, but he talks about the Jews. Well, everybody involved in the story is Jewish. So more than likely what he's really talking about are the elite, right? The leadership in the community or whatever. And so I think that's a dynamic. And actually, let's turn to this next scene, because I think some of that dynamic of fear of what this might mean begins to kind of come to the fore, and we'll move through. So can I get a volunteer to read our next passage? Okay. right. Thank you. Okay, so, we have part two, right? And it's pretty, and this is gonna become a pattern where, Paul and Barnabas are gonna come into a city or a scene. They're gonna be, either go to the synagogue, or they're gonna maybe have some other event. Actually, when we get into Lystra, where there is no synagogue, there's still gonna be structurally a very similar kind of scene of encounter, speaking, preaching their gospel message, receiving some favorable embrace, but then also eliciting resistance. And that's what we start to see here. So verses 44 and 45 tell us, first of all, as I mentioned here, that the content of their message has drummed up, right? And yeah, I think we could probably say that Luke is perhaps exaggerating here, but he wants us to get the point that there were a lot of people that showed up to hear them the next Sabbath. And then in verse 45, right? What is it then that the Jews respond with, right? And here, of course, would be the leadership. But when the Jews saw the crowds, they were filled with jealousy and blaspheming. They contradicted what was spoken by Paul. Now, I thought it was worth just highlighting here this point, which is, it's not so much, and this was very typical. If you remember, there's been a couple things like this that have happened. One is even back in the gospel stories, it's not so much an interest in the truth of the matter as it is how Jesus' way of being threatened power and threatened social arrangements, right? And that's what is being resisted. That's what evokes your jealousy. It's not so much an argument against Jesus per se, as it is who should be allowed in and who should not be allowed in, right? So it's the insider-outsider element that really seems to be at stake for these groups. And I'll come back to that in just a minute and address it directly. Then in 46 and 47, Paul and Barnabas now give us the first of, I think it's 3 different times that they will say this, which tells you that, they're also saying this as a warning as opposed to an absolute statement. Then both Paul and Barnabas spoke out boldly, saying, it was necessary that the word of God should be spoken to you first. Since you rejected and judge yourselves to be unworthy of eternal life, we are now turning to the Gentiles, right? That statement. And that statement, by the way, has been used to profoundly negative effects in the history of Christianity, particularly around Jewish and Christian relations. And this is why I really want to underline here, this is hyperbolic, okay? We will see in every other city where there is a synagogue, the first thing they do is they go to the synagogue, right? They go and they speak to Jews. So whatever it is that's being said here, it's not like some sort of blanket statement about the Jews being rejected now and only going to the Gentiles, or the church somehow replacing Israel. That is incorrect. A couple things, yeah.
Clarification on, you have judged yourself to be unworthy.
Yeah. In their response.
The response is unworthy. Okay.
Yeah, it's yeah. And it's typical, it's very interesting because in the gospel stories, oftentimes, it's not so much that the kind of key protagonist through Jesus or one of the disciples judges someone else. It's that someone else, by doing something, judges themselves. And that's kind of the basic idea. So first of all, the fact that Paul and Barnabas speak with one voice, it highlights the significance of what they're about to say. Their response heightens the seriousness. When they say this, actually, they are probably making their opponents even angrier than they already were. So, kind of an interesting tactic, if you think about it, right? They're upping the ante, doubling down, whatever you want to say. And then they root that statement not just on personal whim. It's not just because, you're threatening us or you're offended by sensibilities or whatever. The turn to the Gentiles that we're talking about, remember, still hyperbolic, is rooted in promises of Scripture, right? That God is actually going to bring in the Gentiles as well as Israel. And so that kind of expands it, roots it in a larger story, which I think is important from their perspective. We then get verses 48 through 52. When the Gentiles heard this, they were glad and praised the word of the Lord. And as many as had been destined for eternal life became believers. Thus the word of the Lord spread throughout the region. But the Jews incited the devout women of high standing and the leading men of the city and stirred up persecution against Paul and Barnabas and drove them out of their region. So they shook the dust off their feet in protest against them and went to Iconium, and the disciples were filled with joy and the Holy Spirit. All right, there's a couple of things I want to say here. First of all, this is not an unexpected statement here, like kind of summary. Many people hear the good news and embrace it. The Gentiles are, they're overjoyed, they're pleased, like they can become full members of the community. There's nothing to bar that, for them. It's kind of what we might say. Of course, the Jewish elite become even more angry, and it says that they turned women of high standing and leading men of the city. I'm going to come back to this in a minute, but what I think is going on here is that more than likely these are descriptors of people in the city who probably were not Jewish. They were probably Gentile, but they viewed the Jewish community favorably. But this is what I think is interesting. These Jews and Gentiles ally themselves over against the apostles. Why? Because what the apostles are preaching threatens the social arrangements of these Jews and Gentiles. Right? That
Yeah,
together,
we could, we're home today. I'm having some work done on my car, so
having a conversation there.
we're home as well.
All right, lastly then, seeing the impasse, the apostles leave the city, but they don't leave
That'll
in
be great.
disgust.
Okay,
It tells us they leave with joy
thank you much.
and
Yep,
the power of the Spirit.
bye-bye.
And so that's, I don't know what Tom was saying, but I'm gonna keep moving. Any comments, thoughts, questions on this passage? Am I kind of following along here? This is not our normal pace or. All right. Perfect. All right, let's move on then to the next scene. They travel to the new city. We have a volunteer read this passage. Ooh, go ahead. Okay, thank you. Okay, so as I mentioned here, in a way, like we just get a repeat, effectively. Like there's a serial set of events that sound awfully familiar from what we just saw. They leave city in Antioch, and now they're heading back south again, down to Iconium. It tells us in verse 3, that they remain there for a long time. And this is one of the few moments where we're kind of reminded over the course of basically most of chapter 13 into 14, while they're on this first journey, that this probably was about a 4-year journey. Remember that was one of the things I tried to remind us of earlier, that this is not, it feels like it's kind of moving along really fast. And I think that's probably because of Luke's storytelling ability. But this is a longer duration. So they remain in the city, and we start to get some descriptions of what their ministry looks a little bit like beyond just preaching and doing wonders. Right? We've got a couple of places where they go in and they teach, preach, or maybe they perform a miracle or a wonder. And now, though, we start to hear about the upbuilding of the community. And in the next set of verses, we're going to hear about them identifying leadership. Right? So we start to get a sense that they're doing more than just going out and preaching. They're actually starting to set up small communities in these different places, which I think is important because it tells us again that the gospel message and the Jesus way is not just a regional thing, right? It's not just a Jewish thing. It's not just something that's done in Hebrew or Aramaic. And now it's not just something that's done in Palestine or places close by. It is and can be replicated everywhere, basically. It's part of the idea that we get. We then get in verses 4 through 7, and I won't reread these, the sense that the conflict in Iconium begins to intensify, just like it did in the city in Antioch, and the disciples have to leave. In just a moment, we're going to hear that the Iconian folks, they do finally get a chance to put their hands on Paul. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. It's actually after the very next scene. I wanted to stop, though, just for a second here, and this is why I have this question about diaspora experience, because I think it's important for us to think about, well, why are these communities responding to Paul in the way that they're responding? And it kind of hits on several of the themes I've already mentioned, that oftentimes, at least the way that Luke tells the story to us, it's not an objection about Jesus. It's not an objection about a Messiah. It's not even an objection about a raised from the dead Messiah. It's an objection about the possibility that Gentiles can become fully included members in a community with Jews. That seems to be the main threat. Why would that be a threat? You would think that, of course, different people getting along with one another, finding ways to be together would be something that would be appealing. And I mean, obviously, I'm probably projecting a modern sensibility onto an ancient world, right, when I say all those things. And I just wanted to remind us, first of all, to be a diaspora Jew, it's already to be sort of in an experience of precarity, right? Diaspora, that word is not just a neutral word. It literally means to be scattered, right? And typically the scattering events are the events of exile, right? In the Babylonian captivity, etc. But there might have been other captivities and scatterings, perhaps from Antiochus Epiphanes, the guy that I told you about that they named all those cities after. He hated the Jews, tried to destroy the temple. So it's like being in exile, right? And when you're in exile and you have a communal identity, you really want to make sure you maintain that identity. I mean, I'm sure there are lots of you who have, like, your family's immigrated from Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark. I mean, I know I'm doing all the Scandinavian. My family immigrated from, like, the British Isles, I think we probably lost touch with that. But you want to maintain that through certain practices, retaining the language, food, etc. Well, when that's wrapped up with a religious identity, the way it would be for Jews, you could see how much of a threat this is. This is not just a theological threat. this is a threat to communal identity. Right, long term, at least, I think this helps to explain the response. So one of the biggest challenges then, when you're in diaspora, is maintaining identity and cohesion in the community. And therefore, leadership is probably going to be doing a lot of border policing, who can be allowed in and who is not. So this proposal from the apostles that Gentiles and Jews are included in what has happened in Jesus, this is a threat to that. And that's often why I think we keep hearing this. And likewise, the fact that Gentiles themselves sometimes align, and we get this statement here very interestingly in Iconium, where the city itself is almost split in half. Half of the people who are Gentiles side with the Jews, and the other half side with the apostles. And I think a way to explain that is that it's not just the arrangements of the Jews that are threatened, it's also the arrangements of the Gentiles that are threatened. Right? So part of what's being put forward, in other words, is the possibility of a new way of living together, a new way of being. And that is a serious threat in these settings. Linda.
Is this in any way comparable to our present day racial situation?
I think it probably is. Tell me a little bit more about what you're thinking.
The non-white community areas have been released, so to speak, and are thought of differently than they were 30 years ago. Its strength is acceptance in media, acceptance in businesses, wanting acceptance. But there are still divisions, some of them, at least on the surface, being promoted by the race, the non-white race itself. Whether they intend for that to be changed, it's there. And it just seems as you were talking that there are things in the foods and today unpleasant foods. But it's, maybe I'm explaining.
Well, I don't know about the dynamics that you sketched in terms of like, I don't know if we have time to drill down totally. But I do think that there is here some interesting things around ethnicity, insider-outsider status, what the early Christians were thinking and proposing, like the implications of the gospel, and how much of a beautiful possibility, but also a terrifying prospect it was, depending on, and it might have been the same thing for a single person inside. They might have both believed it was amazing and extraordinary and yet terrifying at the same time, because it was being this transformation. And I'm going to hazard something here. I think something starts in the New Testament literature that they never fully work out by the time the New Testament literature is sort of completed. Like we don't ever fully get a real picture of what it would mean for Jews and Gentiles really to live together and maintain their actual identities. Because to be a Jew was to be kosher, and be kosher. Yeah, so there's something that's on the table here that is sort of tantalizing, but also is like a path that we didn't take in a way. Because the church eventually becomes overwhelmingly Gentile, and it problematizes being Jewish. So it literally switches the table. And I don't think that's what Paul was interested in doing, or what Jesus was interested in doing. But,
Rising today.
right.
It's very ugly, right?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. That's right. Yeah.
It's not just that the identity. Higher Testament
Stay separate. Stay separate.
Right.
from the other community.
Well, and it's not only the Old Testament, it's also that we're living at a time that, I'm not saying, I shouldn't say we, as these documents are being produced and as Paul and others are kind of doing what they're doing, there is in the rabbinic world an intensification of the drawing of hard lines, because the rabbinic movement itself was a reforming movement, and it was an attempt to recover more of a biblical sensibility, its purity, its set apartness, etc. And so this is like a direct contradiction to that, right, in a way. And so my point is simply to say that there are biblical passages where there's a kind of sense of set apartness, but there's also other biblical passages, where it's like the Gentiles are going to be included. But at the time, in terms of the dominant discourse of the rabbis, they're really drawing on that separation stuff. And so I think I mentioned this when Peter, remember when Peter goes back after Cornelius is kind of his whole household is converted, and he goes back to the church, and they're not like, tell us about what happened with the Gentiles, or they're like, why did you eat with Gentiles? Like, what were you doing crossing that barrier? That's sort of an expression of this within the church itself, right? It's actually having to grapple with it. So anyway, I thought this would be helpful to highlight kind of what's at stake underneath what feels like pretty pedestrian information, because we keep getting sort of the same theme in a way played over and over in different places. And I hope that this was some help. Let me, I got a chat here. So I'm going to read this out. This is from Tom. When we think about the diaspora, they're away from the temple worship. It means a justification under the law, and even more when Luke is writing his account and the temple itself is destroyed. That's right. So the Jews outside of Christianity had to find another path of being justified before God. And then you find the 3 T's, prayer, righteousness, and repentance, tefillah, tzedekah, teshuvah, but also keeping yourself separate from the world, right? Thanks for that, Tom. And that kind of builds on, right, that sense of identity. All right, let's move on then. Got time for a little bit more. And I really did want to, I was hoping to get to this scene in particular. Can I get a volunteer who's okay?
Like, there was a man sitting not using tea and never walked, for he had been crippled from birth. The very tall as his feet, and Paul, looking at him intensely and seeing that he had saved his heel, said in a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." And the man sprang up and began to walk. When the crowd saw what Paul had done, they shouted in the Thessalonian language, "The gods have come down to us in this form." Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul they called the Son, because he was the chief teacher. The priest of the temple was just outside the city, brought oxen and garments to the gate. He and the crowd wanted to offer sacrifice. And the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of it. They tore their clothes and rushed out into the crowd, shouting, "Friends, why are you doing this? We are mortals just like you, and we mighty good men. And you sing to the living God, who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. The past generations reviled all of their own ways. He has not left himself without a witness, giving you rain from heaven, fruitful seed, filling you with seed in your heart. His word, guarantee rain.
All right. Well, I almost called this team Gentiles be Gentiling, or Gentiles doing Gentile things. So the first thing I just want to highlight for you is at the top, which is, and one of the things that makes this scene unique is that this is one of the places where Paul and Barnabas encountered Gentiles who really have no connection to the synagogue. There's no synagogue that we hear about in the city. As far as we know from archaeological evidence, there was no synagogue or Jewish presence here. So this is unique. This is a scene where they are encountering Gentiles who are not God-fearers in that sense. And that's the case in Lystra, Ephesus, and Athens. Those three episodes all include that. In all three of those encounters, though, of course, there is a confrontation of some type that happens. I think the most dramatic one to me is the one in Ephesus. But it is a confrontation with the gods, right? So here we have a confrontation in the sense with their thoughts about the gods. The same thing is going to happen in Athens. In Ephesus, though, it's really heightened and intensified. So that will replay itself later on. Now, the scene in verses 8 through 10 is actually, if it sounds familiar, it kind of is. It replays a scene that we heard all the way back, I think, in Acts chapter 3, having to do with Peter. The first thing to know, one of the things that I think is important for this is Luke really wants us to be clear that this man was crippled. So he tells us 3 different times, like slightly differently, that this person could not use their legs. He had not been able to use his legs since he was a child because his legs did not work. Like that literally is how he does it. So a multitude of times to emphasize. And I think therefore then to emphasize that is also to heighten how startling this would be if this man is healed, right? The fact that he is definitely injured, was known to be injured for a long time, right, over the course of the whole of his life. The idea that he would now become whole, in a sense, at least from the perspective of the story, that heightens for us what's extraordinary. Now, my second point here is an attempt to maybe make the same point I've made a couple of other times in the course of our time together, not just today, but other days. And that is, we have a repeat scene, basically, right? Paul looks intently at the man, discerns that he has faith, and like invites him to stand up. That literally sounds almost exactly the same as what Peter does back in Acts chapter 3. And several commentators point this out. And as I mentioned here, in both of those accounts, both the one here and back in chapter 3, the healings are connected to faith. In both cases, Peter and Paul look intently at the person who's going to be, and kind of stands out. Both of them result in joyful responses. And then both of them elicit responses from the local religious leaders. In the case of what happens back in chapter 3, it's the Jerusalem leaders. In this case, it's the leaders of the temple of Zeus. So what are we to make of this? There's a repeat here. And I think what we're to make of this is the idea that we've sort of started to get as we've kind of been traveling around, which is that God can do the very same thing that God does in Jerusalem anywhere else. And I think that is the point that is being kind of underlined here, right? The repetition of a scene that took place in Jerusalem in a little cultural backwater. And Lystra was actually the butt of jokes. It was like where I'm from, we made fun of people from Gastonia all the time. We were like, that's like the armpit in North Carolina. Now, if you go to Gastonia today, it's really nice. But back then, we used to make fun of it. I'm sure you guys make fun of, people from Iowa. I don't know what you make fun of. I made fun of people from South Carolina, whatever. People from Virginia made fun of people from North Carolina. You get what you get, I guess. Anyway, this is a cultural backwater. And the idea that the dramatic, remarkable things that happen in the holy city of Jerusalem right, where the temple once stood. But it can happen there. Like, I think that's the point, right? That's why we get these repeats in a sense, is to make that point, right? That God acting in surprising and startling ways can also happen in places where we don't expect it, and oftentimes does. And I can list off a number of historical examples of that, like the Azusa Street revival, or the healing of a woman possessed by a demon in the village of Mertlingen, or any number of little backwater places where things extraordinary happen. All right. The response is Gentiles being Gentiles, right? The gods have come and visited us. And as I mentioned here in verses 11 through 13, this response is a little over the top, but not that much over the top, because there was long expected, or a kind of wide sense of expectation that the gods do from time to time come down and take human form. So they're responding and believing that this might be Zeus and Hermes is not that crazy. There was also one of the commentators that I was working with also noted that in the writings of Ovid, there's a local legend, one that's not very far away, that happens not very far away from Lystra. So the people of Lystra would have known that story, and therefore potentially maybe were more inclined as well to countenance that possibility. They elaborately respond, and of course Paul and Barnabas see this and are scandalized and shocked, and they do everything possible to stop this from happening, right? They tear their clothes, they cry out, they say, we are not divine or gods, we are rather mortal. And I think this is important because it contrasts with an earlier figure that we just heard about a chapter ago, Herod, right? Who, when he's sitting on his bench, looking like a god, he doesn't tell them, I'm not a god, but they do. Interestingly enough, because this is our first encounter with a non-Jewish crowd, we have a more unique message, right? So I want to read this response starting in verse 15. Friends, why are you doing this? We are mortals just like you, and we bring you good news that you should turn from these worthless things to the living God, who made the heaven and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. In past generations, he allowed all the nations to follow their own ways. Yet he has not left himself without a witness in doing good, giving you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, and filling you with food and your hearts with joy. Number one, there is no mention of Scripture here. There is no mention of Jesus here. There's no mention of Jewish tradition here. There is, however, a clear call, a kind of attempt basically to speak in the language that Lystrans would understand, and to make a very important distinction. And that is the distinction between lifeless idols and the living God. Right? And that's who they represent. They do not represent the lifeless idols that you call Zeus and whatever. They represent rather the living God, and we have good news for you. I think the fact that we have also this shows us the flexibility and adaptability of these apostles as they make their way. They kind of contextually change their message to make it fit, make it intelligible in the context where they find themselves. All right, let me stop there and see what kind of comments or questions you might have. Yeah. No, we've already had a couple of episodes. Carrie, you haven't been paying attention. You're gonna be in trouble on the final exam, man. We've already had a couple of these. All right. I'll get you. We'll be good. Yeah. That's a good question. I did not sit with that for very long, in part because we flow almost immediately into hostility. But I think it tells, I think we could probably make a couple of observations off the top of our head. One is that these people were quite serious in their devotion to Zeus and Hermes and others, and in their belief that Paul and Barnabas might be visitors. And that Paul's and Barnabas' message, even though it's contextually, reshaped, still, it's still not fully successful necessarily, or, it's still, they barely are able to make the shift. So those would be my two, and just off the top of my head, observations. Other comments or questions or thoughts? Great. Okay, so let's get to our last set of scenes. Go ahead.
The Jews came there from Antioch and Iconium, one over the crowd. Then they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing that he was dead. But when the disciples surrounded him, he got up and went into the city. And the next day he went on with Barnabas and Derbe. After they had proclaimed the good news to that city and had made many disciples, they returned to Lystra, then on to Iconium and Antioch. There they strengthened the souls of the disciples of the disciples and encouraged them to continue in the faith, saying, "This is through many persecutions that we must enter the kingdom of God." And after they had appointed elders for them in each church, with prayer and fasting, they entrusted them to the Lord, in whom they had come to believe. Then they passed through Pisidia and came to Pamphylia. When they had spoken the word in Perga, they went down to Aquileia. I'm saying this right, I hope. From there they sailed back to Antioch, where they had been commended to the grace of God for the work that they had completed. When they arrived, they called the church together and related all that God had done with them, and how he had opened the door of faith for the Gentiles. And they stayed there with the disciples.
All right. So we come to the conclusion of Paul and Barnabas' first journey out of 3 that we're going to hear about in Acts. But before we come to that conclusion, there are a couple of details that we have to wrap up. The first is the first of many, Paul being beaten or mistreated in verses 19 through 21. The text kind of tells us that they have been sort of slowly but surely moving away from city of Antioch through Iconium down to Lystra, but they can't necessarily leave the trouble behind. The trouble kind of follows them down. And so the Jews here, again, the Jewish elite, more than likely, they come down and they stir up and win over the crowd. We don't know exactly how, but again, the idea that the Jews would find allies among Gentiles over against probably suggests to us that people start to discern the threat that the message, the gospel message, means to their social arrangements, basically, to their way of being there. And that's certainly the case when we get to the Ephesus scene, and you'll see that there. It's kind of bound up with economics as well. They finally do violence to Paul. It says that they stoned him and dragged him out of the city, supposing that he was dead. Now, I think this is interesting because this is another pattern that we see here of Paul being put outside the city, left for dead, and then being revived and going back into the city. It sounds an awful lot like Jesus to me, right? That Jesus is crucified outside of the city, buried outside the city, raised from the dead, and there's even one gospel that tells us that Jesus was in the city, in particular, I think it's in Matthew. So why does that appear? Why does Luke tell these details in this way? He could have told these details in any other way. Why does he tell them in this way? I think the deep point is again to show to us that what happened in Jerusalem is not sequestered in Jerusalem. It doesn't stay there. It goes, travels. The same things can be replicated in a kind of non-identical sense, right? And I think this is a big part of the message. I mean, even Terry's point, I thought only Jesus could heal. One of the reasons why we see the apostles healing is precisely what Jesus did can be replicated, right? Or to follow him. And that's kind of the argument I think that Acts as a whole is trying to make. After he makes his way back in, they proclaim, it says, the gospel. Just such a remarkable thing because, I mean, even verse 20. But when the disciples surrounded him, got up and went into the city. It's so pedestrian, right? And then the next day he travels, right? Yeah, we're gonna go down to Derby. Let's go, right? You know, and then it tells us after they had proclaimed the good news to that city, they made many disciples. They returned to Lystra, then on to Iconium and Antioch. There they strengthened the souls of the. Now, I didn't check this, so that would be interesting to check if that's city in Antioch there, which means they're literally retracing their steps and going back into the den of the lion. But it is though. I started in verses 22 and 23, and I think these are important because they start to fill out what are the apostles doing for 4 years, right? They strengthen the souls of the disciples and encourage them, right? They do the work of building up. They do the work of teaching, of encouraging, of showing the community that it is possible to follow after Jesus, etc. And then in verse 23, and after they of course, they highlight the difficulty, right? That quote there, it is through many persecutions, right? Through many trials. More than likely, that's another word there. I didn't have a chance to check the grammar. It is through those that we must enter the kingdom of God. It's a difficult work, right? And so we can expect to have failures. But then it tells us, and after that, after they had appointed elders for them in each church with prayer and fasting, they entrusted them to the Lord. Right? So they build up the community, and then they identify people who seem to be a good fit for leadership, right? And they leave them in charge to help shepherd these small communities, right? So what do we see there? We see, again, a replication of the model that we've already seen in Jerusalem, right? So this idea of the church spreading, right? Again, the events, the meaning of the gospel, et cetera, it's not just for one place or one people or one language. It's for everyone. Then we get final return, right? Verses 24 through 28. And you read all of that beautifully, right? All those different places. I'm sure as you got into it, you're like, uh-oh, that last paragraph.
I'm going to offer again, but I read it.
Yeah. And they make their way back to Antioch. And the only thing I wanted to highlight here was this idea of calling the church together and then sharing. And I thought it was just important to frame that, not so much just to remind us, more than really to say this is exactly what the text says, but to remind us that it wasn't the Antiochian church that empowered and sent them forth, it was the Spirit. And so when they return, they have all kinds of things to report that the Spirit was doing, right? So they share the work of the Spirit, and I use this phrase, I took it from Jonathan Edwards, The Surprising Works of God. I won't often quote Jonathan Edwards, but there's one. So you get that one for free. All right. Comments, questions, thoughts? Oh,
We have a comment up there.
I do, yes. Tom says, I remember one teacher pointing out this passage as a picture of perseverance, being stoned and then going back into the same city again. Yep. Yeah, amen. More power to you. Tough one. By standing up in the face of something like that. I have a closing question. that I sent out to everyone. And it really plays on this idea of seeing similar events now happening in other places, with differences that are important. But I framed it this way: are there any times when you can remember God acting in an unexpected way in an unexpected place? And my real emphasis is on the unexpected place part, but like, you know, God doing something, like for me, for instance, I'm struggling with the idea that my brother came around, because it's so unexpected, let me just tell you. But it's also beautiful, right? So are there things like that, like unexpected way, unexpected place, where you are surprised by God? So take a few minutes, give you about 5 to 7 to share, and then we'll come back together as a large group. All right.
I think I'm the only.
Hey, what do you think about adoption? I never, we never talked about adoption. I take care of something that has been out of his own heart. We had to approve the growing of kids, we had 3 kids, we were at that point where they were getting to the high. And 9 months later, we got a little boy from Russia. So, that was, and the fact that and that process was very always go in there. And so it's cleaning up all of that desire and when you're thinking about it for a while, like, a little unexpected, at least for me, it was unexpected. Yeah, and, it looks like 24.
Then you make.